Hi, I'm Ben Haller, and the title of my talk is Speciation in Complex Habitats. I'm at McGill University with Andrew Hendry, but this research was done with Rupert Matsuko and Ulf Diekman as part of my participation in the Young Scientist Summer Program here at YASA. So species come tautologically from the process of speciation, the branching of the tree of life. Incidentally, since my work sometimes involves asexual taxa, I'll be using the term speciation in a broad sense to include evolutionary branching. So to understand why there are so many species, we need to understand how speciation works and what promotes or inhibits it. The drawing at right was made by Charles Darwin. It's the earliest depiction of an evolutionary tree. To explain the origins of biodiversity, we need to zoom in on this tree and focus on an individual branching point. And that's what the model that I'll be showing you today is designed to do. So research indicates that environmental heterogeneity, and this ties into the discussion that we were just having actually very nicely, is often important to the process of speciation. Environments can vary spatially in two common ways. There can be smooth gradients from one type of environment to another, such as the gradient from plains to mountaintops shown here. Notice that this gradient is nonlinear. The plains are the same for miles and miles, and then as you go up the slope of the mountain, the environment changes more and more rapidly. There can also be random patchiness in the environment. This rather extreme example is of a tidal wetland, but in any forest or meadow or any kind of environment, there are spots that are dry or moist or hotter or cooler. This sort of patchiness is very common. So this environmental variation is important to speciation for three reasons. First of all, a heterogeneous landscape contains a diversity of local environments and contrasts, and if any of those local circumstances promote speciation, then the landscape as a whole may promote speciation. In other words, the sum may be greater than the average of its parts. Second, heterogeneity can provide refugia, areas that act as safe havens for organisms, allowing colonization and adaptation in environments that would otherwise be too inhospitable. An oasis in a desert, for example, could be a refugium that would allow a species to survive in the harsh desert environment, and over time that species might become adapted to the surrounding desert and become a new desert species. And third, local adaptation can act as what's called a magic trait, which we've talked about already today, a trait that governs both fitness and reproductive isolation. Organisms are likely to choose mates that are spatially proximate, and spatially proximate mates are likely to be adapted to similar local conditions. So assortative mating is an inseparable side effect of local adaptation in an environment with autocorrelated heterogeneity, where points that are close in space are similar in their environmental characteristics. And that's provided that the dispersal distance of the organisms is sufficiently short. This so-called magic property should make speciation much more likely in a heterogeneous environment. So to investigate these ideas further, I built a speciation model based upon an earlier model in Heinz, Matsuko, and Diekman 2009. It's an individual-based model with asexual reproduction for now, although I intend to extend it to the sexual case in the future. Time in the model is continuous with overlapping generations, and natal dispersal is modeled with a Gaussian offset from the parental location. Evolution occurs in the ecological trait of the individuals, and there's local competition based on that ecological trait. So individuals compete most strongly with individuals that are both close to them in space and similar to them in ecology. Speciation occurs both as a result of this competition and as a result of adaptation to the environment. Individuals in the model live in a two-dimensional space, like the one pictured there, that's complexly heterogeneous. And the complexity of the spatial structure is the really new thing about my model. So let's talk about that a little more. Let's look in more detail at how landscapes are built in my model. First, there's the effect of slope, seen here, which makes a linear gradient from the left to the right edge of the environment. This is really the only type of environmental variation that's been explored in previous studies of this kind, but real environments vary non-linearly, and real environments are patchy, as we saw before. So adding in a little bit of curvature has the effect of making the variation non-linear. The environment changes slowly on the left and rapidly on the right. This is like the gradient from the plains to the mountaintop that we saw before. When curvature is high relative to slope, the function that determines the environment becomes parabolic, so that the middle of the environment is different from the two edges. This might be seen in the real world in a river valley, for example. Additionally, I modeled spatially continuous patchiness. For this, I used two parameters, the amplitude or volume of a noise function and the autocorrelation length or distance scale of that noise. So let's focus on one particular slope and curvature, and let's look at the effects of amplitude first. Here you can see the effect of a small amplitude of added noise. The gradient of the landscape is still dominant, but there's a bit of variation. As the amplitude increases, the noise gets stronger until it comes to dominate the landscape, somewhat obscuring the underlying gradient. This looks to me rather like the patchy wetlands that we saw before. You've been seeing a very short autocorrelation length, which means that the noise is very fine-grained in space. As the autocorrelation length increases, the noise gets more blurry and its scale becomes broader. A large autocorrelation length, representing very broad-scale random variation in the landscape, might be like the broad rolling hills shown here. So it's late at night and I need to keep you all awake, so I'm going to transition to a little model demonstration here now. That doesn't need to be there, and that does. Okay, so now I need to be able to see the screen. So this is my model in action. If I can get it started here. Where's my cursor? There it is. Okay, so the green crosses here are individuals that are being born and are dying in a two-dimensional landscape. There's an ecological gradient along the x-axis from red to blue that defines the kind of individual that would be most fit at that point in space. Each individual has an ecological trait value, shown as its color, that defines the type of environment where it's most fit. At the start of the run, all the individuals were green, so they were most fit in the center, but because there's selection and heredity and mutation in this model, the population can evolve over time, and it's already doing so. You can see the frequency of different values of the ecological trait in the plot, the colored one toward the center bottom. As you can see, the population has branched into discrete subpopulations of different colors, each well adapted to its own local portion of the environment, of the ecological gradient. So what allowed them to do this? Essentially, it has to do with the spatial clumping that you see. The individuals have a dispersal distance trait, as I mentioned before, and that's constant for any given run of the model. In this run, the dispersal distance is quite low, so spatial clumping occurs. Offspring stay close to their parents on the same part of the gradient, and so local adaptation to the gradient becomes possible over time. We get blue subpopulations and red ones and green ones, each well adapted to the part of the space that they inhabit. I can pull up a graph of the ecological trait values over time, and put it on the other screen. Let's bring it over here. And okay, so I can pull that up, and you can see that branching into discrete groups, which we might call species, has occurred. Incidentally, you might notice that the diversity was actually highest in the middle of the run. Well, it's still settling down. We had branches then that have been that are going to be driven extinct, and the model is going to settle down into a steady state of 3 branches, which is interesting. This pattern of initial over-diversification followed by a weeding out of some branches is actually observed in some real-world evolutionary trees. So now let's close that guy, pause. So let's try a different value for the dispersal trait. Instead of 0.05, let's try 3, meaning that offspring end up quite far from their parents. And then let's restart the simulation and see what happens. Okay, so this time, because of the high dispersal, it's hard for the population to become adapted to local environmental conditions. They're smeared all over the landscape, and so they keep a value of the ecological trait that's close to green to maximize their average fitness. We could let this run for a while, and transitory branches might be seen, but they would soon go extinct, and the green branch would persist. So let's try one final parameterization. Let's add a little noise to the environment. Let's change the amplitude of noise from 0, no noise, to 1, lots of noise. And let's bring the dispersal trait back down to the value that it had before. Restart the simulation. There we've got our heterogeneous environment. And we can run that. Now, you can see that the initial populations, which are green, are rather trapped in those parts of the landscape that are green. Outside of those green areas, the landscape changes so rapidly and extremely that it's very hard for the organisms to adapt to new areas. Eventually, a few populations will succeed to a limited extent, but the noise has a profound effect upon their ability to diversify. So that is, in a nutshell, what my research is about. I'm looking at the effects of spatial variation and dispersal behavior on the potential for evolutionary branching in a population. And these effects are quite complex. Noise doesn't always inhibit branching, and short dispersal distance doesn't always promote it. The interactions between the various factors are quite complex and interesting. So let's go back to my slides so that you can see some of my results. Okay, and I've got to find where I was, and okay. So I can only show you a very few results in the time that I have, but I'll try to put together a bit of a story for you so that you can see the kind of insight that this model can give. One simple finding is that intermediate and environmental gradients most strongly promote branching. This is actually confirmation of results by previous studies. With no slope, there's no variation in the environment, and so there's no selective pressure for subpopulations to diverge. With very high slopes, the environment changes so rapidly that it's difficult for individuals to explore and adapt to new parts of the environment. They become restricted to the small zone where they're most fit. This graph shows a two-way interaction. As we saw before, intermediate slopes promote branching. Here we see that steep environmental gradients with long distance dispersal particularly strongly inhibits evolutionary branching. On a steep gradient, dispersing a long distance is very likely to be lethal because you're likely to land in a very different and probably unfavorable environment. And the steeper the gradient, the more important it is that dispersal be short range. Finally, this is a three-way interaction. Each of these plots shows the interaction between noise and slope amplitude. Oh, and the y-axis or the upward axis on all of these plots in the previous slides as well is the propensity for branching, I should have mentioned. So the left plot is for low dispersal, then medium dispersal in the middle, and on the right is the high dispersal case. And what this shows is that when noise amplitude and gradient slope are both high, long-range dispersal actually promotes branching. So let's put this together. Remember that the two-way interaction that we saw on the left showed that long-distance dispersal on a steep slope was very bad for evolutionary branching because it was likely to be lethal. Then, though, we saw what seemed to be almost the opposite message. Long-distance dispersal on a steep slope is good for branching if noise amplitude is high. I think this is because the noise creates safe pockets on the slope, refugia, that organisms can land in when they disperse, allowing the slope to be colonized. Since my model is the first to ever look at these kinds of effects of noise, this is a new and rather thought-provoking finding, I think. So that's just a tiny taste of the kinds of effects and interactions that my model has revealed. There's a ton of other plots that I could show you. In broad terms, though, I can conclude that intermediate levels of environmental variation strongly promote branching, while too little or too much variation inhibits branching. Our model allows us to predict the biodiversity effects of dispersal distance, the size of refugia, and the shape and steepness of gradients. And these quantitative predictions have implications for biodiversity conservation, and I'd like to talk very briefly about that, and I think it ties in rather nicely with the previous talk. So this is all a bit speculative, but here are a few thoughts that I've had about what my model might mean for conservation. First of all, if the heterogeneous environmental conditions that generated extant biodiversity are homogenized, it may lead to the collapse of that biodiversity, reverse speciation. So heterogeneity, not only uniform habitat, needs to be maintained. Second, the role of refugia in hostile environments should also be considered. For one thing, urban refugia, like parks and background gardens, may have an effect on adaptation to coexistence with humans in urban environments, which may be important for future survival of species. Also, refugia may have some utility in promoting adaptation of species to future conditions expected due to climate change. rather than just using assisted migration to help species track a constant environment, we could actually try to help them adapt by using assisted dispersal into refugia that are surrounded by warmer, drier habitat, and that would provide a selection pressure in the desired direction, according to my model's findings. So I'd like to thank these people and funding agencies for their support, and thank you for listening. There's him right here. Yeah.
My question is very simple. What you say that we have to provide refuge to species in order to give them time for adaptation. Are you thinking about the plasticity of organisms? Are you thinking that organisms are plastic and plasticity is a way to give them time to adapt to the new conditions? Or you don't? I haven't seen in these models any mention about plasticity of organisms. So I would like you to comment.
Yeah, so the question is about plasticity and whether that's what I have in mind or not. You're right, this model does not contain plasticity. And I do think the plasticity is important, and it would be a great thing to add into the model. What I'm talking about in the context of refugia helping promote diversification and retain the diversity that we have is a little different, though, from plasticity. It's more the idea that suppose you have organisms that are well adapted to the green environment. They're in the center of the space here. The green refugia in the blue part of the slope might actually, they would be a place where the green adapted species could go to, and it could survive there, but it would be surrounded by blue environment, and so a selective pressure would exist for it to perhaps learn to be more blue and eventually enter the blue habitat because it's in that small constrained space. That's more the effect that I'm seeing in my model, but plasticity obviously is going to be very important to that as well, yeah. Does that help address that?
Again, it's a comment, and I want to pick up the refugee idea and emphasize how important it is, and talk a little bit about some of the silliness that comes from some ecologists in respect to that. There's a concept called ecological traps that would be used to argue against your point about the future, and it completely ignores the possibility of evolution. And I've seen in my own city an exhibitor hawk, which moved out of the mountains. It was once very rare, took up residence in the city, and it was immediately identified in the city as an ecological trap because of a particular disease. 20 years later, the young of that species had evolved resistance to that disease, and the bird is nesting all over the city successfully.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. Yeah, that's great. Any other questions?
No further questions?
Okay, thank you.
I would like to thank them, but also